Hi Angels, this will be the chapter 3 of You Are My Heroes by Lavender Thoughts 21 on AO3, Breakfast Trouble. It took a half hour for Izuku to calm down again, as well as calm as he could be after a meltdown. The boy had stopped his crying and was now quietly eating his Twinkie at the dining room table. However, he was still roughly pulling his green curls with his free hand. Obviously, he was still upset. Bakugo stayed standing next to the pulled-out chair adjacent to Midoriya, carefully eyeing Aizawa with a straight face. Aizawa stared back and noticed that the boy was clenching his right fist. It was shaking a bit. "Do you have something?" Aizawa questioned, and the boy shook his head no. "Let me see," Aizawa urged, and Bakugo stayed still for a moment before opening his palm and raising it to Aizawa for a better look. Aizawa let out a small gasp as he saw trace amounts of blood in the little's palm. Bakugo tilted his head slightly to the right, confused by the man's expression. "Can I touch your hand?" Aizawa asked, and the boy nodded. Aizawa gently kneeled down and moved Katsuki's hand for a better look. Nail marks were going straight down the palm, skin slightly torn with force. The bleeding was almost non-existent, except for the red in the pulled skin. Aizawa knew immediately what caused it. The little nail imprints were from Izuku squeezing Katsuki's hand too tightly on the walk home. The awkward way Izuku held hands matched where the wounds were. All the internal struggle he held in found a small escape in the tight grip of his friend. Aizawa got up and quickly ran to the restroom, opening the mirror to the shelf behind it. He grabbed the small first aid kit and rushed back to Katsuki. "This might sting, but it's going to help," Aizawa told Bakugo loudly, making sure the blonde could hear him. Nervously, he opened an alcohol wipe and pressed it against Bakugo's torn skin. To his amazement, Bakugo stayed still and looked him straight in the eyes without change. Aizawa thought the boy would be in shambles by now, yelling out from the unpleasant burn. "Does it hurt?" Aizawa asked, and Bakugo didn't answer. So instead of pushing his luck, Aizawa wrapped the hand in a bandage. "Kachin okay?" Izuku let out a soft whimper from the table. His Twinkie was now finished as he stared. Baku nodded at him, raising his hand to show the boy his freshly wrapped palm. "How does a real breakfast sound, Izuku?" Aizawa asked, and the boy held confusion in his eyes. "Food makes a sound?" Izuku asked, and Aizawa stifled a laugh. "I meant if you want me to make you something to eat." "You going to make food?" Izuku asked, eyes wide with excitement. "For me?" "Yes." Aizawa smiled, but then Izuku's expression changed. The sudden excitement left his eyes and was instead replaced with a dark gloom. "For Kachan?" Izuku asked in a smaller voice, his breath starting to shudder. "Yes, darling, for Bakugo too," Aizawa replied, not disregarding the implication that sometimes one was fed while the other wasn't. Quiet hands, Izuku muttered to himself as his excitement returned. Aizawa frowned at this, and the boy held still to his chair, grasping the sides of the seat and mumbled to himself. "It's okay, Izuku, no quiet hands." Aizawa reassured him, and Izuku looked at Katsuki, who was climbing the chair to sit next to him. "Quiet hands?" Midoriya asked Bakugo, and the blonde shook his head no. Izuku jumped off his chair and started to bounce on his heels, flapping his hands happily. These were different from his meltdowns. These movements were fast, but not violent. Instead of smacking his chest, the boy softly tapped his collarbone every now and then. As Aizawa started cooking a quick breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, he saw Bakugo playing with the table mats on the table. They were made of plastic and had a lined texture for better grip. Bakugo was rubbing his hands on them, loving the feeling of the ridges on his backhands. "Almost done?" Aizawa said as he put the scrambled eggs on 2 plates. One pink plate with floral patterns and another pink one with Bobby on it. "Food!" Izuku exclaimed, and his movements changed. His body suddenly stopped what it was previously doing, and he did what Aizawa could only describe as a dance of sorts. Izuku's hands were at his sides, but slightly away from his body, feet apart. It was his legs that did the dancing. He swayed left to right with his feet glued to the ground, bending one of his knees, then the other. Aizawa was reminded of video games. Izuku looked like he was in an animation. Aizawa set down the Barbie plate in front of Bakugo, who had taken his face off the mat at the introduction of food. The floral pattern was set on Izuku's mat, and the young boy quickly jumped up his seat and picked up the small metal fork beside it. "Yummy food!" Izuku exclaimed as he shoved some egg in his mouth, using his free hand to tap on the table. Bakugo looked at his small metal fork on the plate and grabbed it. But instead of using it, he placed it on the side and instead picked up bits of egg with his fingers. Bakugo huffed angrily and let go quickly, waving his hand around for a second before rubbing his index and thumb together viciously. Bakugo let out a whimper as he rubbed his fingers on the table. The slightly oily texture of the eggs made him grimace. "Use the fork, sweetheart," Aizawa told the blonde, and handed him a napkin, which the boy used to get the remaining oil off his fingers. "No!" Bakugu exclaimed and slapped Aizawa's hand away, along with the fork. Bakugu, we don't throw things, Aizawa scolded him but didn't change his tone. Bakugu huffed angrily and glared at the fork. Just try it. Aizawa handed the fallen fork back to Bakugu, who hesitating took it into his hands. As Bakugu slowly grabbed a piece of egg with the fork, Aizawa looked back at Izuku. The green one seemed to be eating fine and using the utensils correctly. Though Aizawa was shocked when Bakugu suddenly slammed his fist on the table. There were tears in his eyes as he bit down on the metal fork. Aizawa cringed as the boy instinctively bit harder and shook his head. "Let go, Katsuki!" Aizawa shouted as he tried to help the boy get the fork out of his mouth. Once he did manage to let go, the fork fell out of his mouth and to the ground. Bakugu whimpered as he repeatedly slapped his mouth with the palm of his hand. "Shh, it's okay, you don't have to use the fork." Aizawa reassured the small boy and grabbed his arm, so he would stop smacking himself, but the boy just shoved Aizawa away. "Kachan hates metal on his teeth," Izuku said in between bites, not sparing a glance away from his own food. "Now he tells me," Aizawa let out a sigh. Aizawa went to his pantry and got out a plastic spoon. It was a white generic one, the kind you get when you have a birthday party. Granted, it was too big for the 3-year-old's little hands, but it was much better than the metal spoon he gave him. "Here, try this one," Aizawa asked, and Bakugu held still. Bakugu grabbed the fork and let out a final shudder before trying the new fork. Aizawa watched more carefully this time, and observed that once Katsuki put the food in his mouth, he bit down on the fork while sliding it out of his mouth. Aizawa cringed at the thought of doing that with a metal fork. He would have freaked out too. This could easily be fixed by teaching Bakugu how to use a fork correctly. Bakugu was just a kid. "Better?" Aizawa asked, and Bakugu huffed. The sound of the toaster finishing made Aizawa flinch. He had forgotten about that. Quickly he spread some butter on the 2 pieces and set one on Bakugu's plate. Then he set one on Izuku's half-finished plate. That's when all hell broke loose. Izuku started to scream, and it shocked everyone in the room. Even Bakugu suddenly jumped at the sound before taking off his hearing aids. "What's wrong?" Aizawa asked as the boy started to scream louder, tears streaming down his cheeks. Izuku's face turned red as he whined before screaming again. "Stupid!" Bakugu yelled out at Aizawa. Aizawa let out a confused sound, and he would have laughed at Katsuki's sudden word if it were not for the screaming child next to him. "Stupid fuck!" Bakugu yelled out again, glaring at Aizawa with anger. "Bakugu," Aizawa scolded, but of course it fell on literal deaf ears. The blonde boy couldn't hear him right now. Bakugu reached over to Midoriya's plate and pulled the toast off the eggs, setting it down on the table. Izuku stopped screaming, but still had shuddering whines escaping his throat. Izuku picked up his fork and poked his food. There were crumbs from the toast on his eggs. Izuku let out a whimper as he pushed his plate away, more tears falling from his face. "I'm sorry, darling, your food was touched and it was my fault," Aizawa softly whispered to the boy before grabbing the plate and setting it farther away from the green boy. Luckily, there was still some egg in the pan, Aizawa's share. Aizawa set down a whole different plate in front of Izuku. This plate was a pure soft pink color. The boy picked up his fork and touched the scrambled eggs in front of him. Slowly, he grabbed a piece and put it in his mouth. "Thank you," Izuku mumbled as he chewed his food slowly. "You're welcome, such a good boy with manners," Aizawa praised. Bakugu huffed. His hearing aids were back in. "You're such a good boy too, sweetheart," helping Izuku with his plate. Aizawa made sure to praise the blonde too. He was clearly helping out earlier. The rest of breakfast was calm. Everyone ate their fill, except Bakugu didn't touch his toast, instead giving it to Izuku, who happily ate everything on his plate, as long as it didn't touch. Bakugu finished his plate first, one would assume because he didn't eat his toast, but the truth was that Izuku was a slow eater. The boy would take a bite and slowly chew it, never having too much food in his mouth at once. "Still hungry?" Aizawa asked Bakugu, as the blonde stared at the banana on the counter table. It was in a bowl along with other fruits. Bakugu nodded, and Aizawa grabbed the fruit and peeled it halfway before giving it to the boy. Once Bakugu took a bite, his eyes shined at the fruit before him. His free hand smacked the table softly multiple times, slowly increasing hits each time he took a bite, and slowly decreasing as he chewed. Once Bakugu finished, he just pushed his plate away along with the peel. He put his face on the table mat again, the ridges pulling his skin softly each time he moved. This continued as Aizawa washed the dishes and waited for Izuku to finish eating. It looked like the banana was the blonde's favorite fruit by the way he savored it. "Can we see TV now?" Izuku asked as he finished his plate, pushing it away from him like Katsuki did. "Of course, darling." Aizawa led the boys to the couch and turned on the television. Luckily, there were some cartoons on this early. Granted, it were boring educational cartoons, but it was better than nothing. Bakugo hopped on the couch, testing the texture of the couch by rubbing his hands on it before sitting down. Izuku, on the other hand, remained standing swaying side to side. This is the end of Chapter 3. I'll see you in Chapter 4. Have a good day, angels.